The supermarket's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting their pale glow over the rows of neatly stocked shelves. Marissa wandered aimlessly through the aisles, her list half forgotten in the recesses of her mind. At 52, her days had taken on a rhythm so predictable it barely required her attention. Mornings spent tending to a small garden behind her townhouse, afternoons reading by the window, and evenings alone with the faint hum of a television for company. It wasn't a bad life, she often reminded herself. Just still. She paused in front of a display of oranges, turning one over in her hand. The citrusy tang in the air reminded her of summers long gone, of days when her children were young and the house had been full of laughter. Now they were grown and scattered, and the silence that filled her home was both a comfort and an ache. "Those look good," a voice broke through her thoughts. Marissa looked up, startled, to see a man standing a few feet away. He was younger, early 30s maybe, with an easy smile and kind brown eyes. His dark hair curled slightly at the ends, and he had a way of standing that suggested he didn't mind waiting for the world to catch up to him. She blinked, unsure if he was talking to her. "The oranges." He nodded, stepping closer to reach for one. "Yeah, best ones coming this time of year. You can tell by the weight." He held up an orange, balancing it in his palm. "See, feels heavier than it looks. That's how you know it's juicy." Marissa couldn't help but smile at his earnestness. "I'll have to remember that." He grinned, setting the fruit into his basket. "Trust me, you won't regret it." She watched as he moved down the aisle, his presence lingering like the faint scent of oranges. It was such a small interaction, but it stayed with her as she finished her shopping, as she loaded her car, as she unpacked her groceries in the stillness of her kitchen. For the first time in years, someone had disrupted her routine. She couldn't quite put her finger on why that mattered. That it wasn't the last time Marissa saw him. A week later, she found herself back at the same supermarket, moving slowly through the aisles. She had no need for groceries so soon, but she convinced herself that she'd forgotten a few essentials. As she turned the corner near the produce section, there he was, browsing the apples this time, the same easy smile on his face. "Hey, orange lady," he greeted her with a playful grin. She laughed despite herself. "That's a new one. Should I call you Apple Man then?" "Fair's fair," he replied, his tone warm. "Marissa, right?" Her breath caught for a moment. She hadn't expected him to remember. "That's me. And you are?" "Ethan." He extended a hand, his grip firm but gentle. From there, their conversation flowed effortlessly. They talked about the best ways to store fruit, swapped cooking tips, and eventually wandered the aisles together, laughing over trivial things like the absurd price of organic kale. It was all so easy, so natural, that Marissa almost forgot the difference in their ages. "Do you come here often?" he asked as they lingered near the bakery. "Every week," she admitted, feeling a little self-conscious. "It's the one outing I can count on." Ethan tilted his head, studying her. "You deserve more than just a weekly trip to the grocery store." His words lingered long after he left with a loaf of sourdough and a wave goodbye. Marissa spent the next few days thinking about him. His kindness, his curiosity, and the way his presence made her feel lighter, as though the weight of her quiet life had lifted just a little. The next time they crossed paths, Ethan suggested coffee. She hesitated, unsure if it was appropriate, but his enthusiasm swept her hesitation away. They spent an hour at a small cafe nearby, sipping lattes and sharing fragments of their lives. Marissa told him about her children, her late husband, and her quiet days filled with gardening and books. Ethan talked about his job as a freelance writer, his love of hiking, and the dog he'd recently adopted, a boisterous golden retriever named Daisy. Marissa couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed so freely. It wasn't just the stories Ethan told. It was his energy, the way he leaned forward when he listened, as if every word she said mattered. By the time they parted, Marissa felt a strange mix of emotions: happiness, confusion, and something she couldn't quite name. When she returned home, the stillness of her townhouse felt heavier than usual. Something about Ethan had stirred a part of her she thought had gone quiet forever. She wasn't sure if it was good or bad, but for the first time in years, she wasn't just passing the time. She was living it. Marissa didn't expect her feelings for Ethan to grow, but they did, slowly, like the first flowers of spring pushing through frost. They met more frequently, though never intentionally. Sometimes at the grocery store, sometimes at the cafe where he worked on his writing. Each meeting felt like a pleasant surprise, a brief reprieve from her quiet days. They exchanged books, debated over which movies were worth watching, and laughed about Daisy's antics. Ethan had started bringing her stories about the dog as if Marissa was a part of Daisy's life too. And then came the moment that changed everything. It was late afternoon, and the two of them had taken their coffee to the park. A golden haze filtered through the trees, the sun casting long shadows on the grass. Ethan had Daisy on a leash, and the dog tugged eagerly toward a patch of ducks floating lazily in the pond. "She's relentless," Ethan said with a chuckle, letting Daisy lead the way. Marissa smiled but stayed quiet, her gaze lingering on the way the sunlight caught in his hair. He looked carefree, so at ease with the world in a way she hadn't felt in years. "Are you okay?" Ethan's voice pulled her back, his eyes scanning her face. "I'm fine," she replied quickly, but her heart wasn't in it. "You seem quiet." He paused, stepping closer. "Something on your mind?" Marissa hesitated. For a moment, the truth teetered on the edge of her lips. "Yes. You're on my mind. More than you should be." But instead, she shook her head. "It's nothing," she said softly. Ethan didn't push, though he watched her carefully for a moment longer. When Daisy barked at the ducks, he turned back to the leash with a laugh, leaving Marissa to wrestle with the storm inside her. That night, alone in her house, she allowed herself to admit it. She felt something for him. More than friendship, more than admiration. She wanted to see him smile every day, to hear his thoughts, to feel the warmth he brought into her life. But the realization terrified her. She couldn't ignore the 20-year age gap, the societal whispers that would follow if anyone knew. And yet, wasn't she allowed to want? To feel? Her reflection in the mirror stared back at her, lines around her eyes, gray streaks in her hair. She touched her face gently, as if trying to remember who she was beneath the years. This wasn't supposed to happen. She'd buried that part of herself long ago, thinking love and desire belonged to younger versions of her. But Ethan had awakened something she thought was lost, and now it refused to be silenced. For the first time in years, her dreams were vivid and filled with color. And in each of them he was there that Marissa's days were no longer simple. They were alive with noise. Not the comforting hum of her television or the rustle of leaves outside her window, but the loud, chaotic sound of her thoughts. Every time she saw Ethan, her heart betrayed her. It skipped, it fluttered. It betrayed her age, her reason, her rules. She told herself this was a passing infatuation, a fleeting spark that would burn out if she ignored it. But ignoring him was impossible. When they met, he brought an energy she hadn't realized she'd been missing. His stories about Daisy's misadventures were filled with such vivid detail that Marissa felt as if she were there, watching the dog chase her tail in circles or bark at an unbothered cat. He shared drafts of his articles, seeking her opinion with genuine curiosity, making her feel valued in a way she hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, as they sat by the cafe window, Ethan had slid a short story across the table. "It's not finished," he admitted, leaning back with a nervous grin. "But I'd love your take." Marissa adjusted her reading glasses and began to skim the pages. His handwriting in the margins was messy, notes scrawled as if they were thoughts he couldn't let escape. She felt his gaze on her the entire time, warm and expectant, and it made her chest tighten. "It's beautiful," she said finally, setting the pages down. Ethan's smile was radiant, the kind of smile that made her feel she'd done something extraordinary just by existing. Later that evening, as she watered her plants, she caught herself smiling at the memory of him. Then, just as quickly, her smile faded. What was she doing? She turned off the faucet and sat on the porch, letting the cool air wrap around her. Her thoughts churned like a storm, the same questions crashing over and over. Why do I feel this way? The answer was painfully clear. He made her feel alive in ways she hadn't felt in decades. But with that answer came a cascade of fears. What would her children say if they knew? What would Ethan's friends think of him spending time with a woman 20 years older? What would people whisper behind her back? She hated that she cared about those things, but she did. And then there was the deeper fear. The one that whispered cruelly late at night when she was most vulnerable. What if this is nothing to him? What if he's just kind and friendly, and I'm the fool who misread the signs? That thought made her stomach twist. She didn't want to lose him, not even the friendship they had built so easily. And yet, every time he called her name, every time he laughed at one of her dry jokes or leaned in just a little too close to show her something on his phone, she felt herself fall further. One evening, as she folded laundry, the decision she'd been avoiding crashed over her. She had to act, to move this connection forward, or let it go entirely. She grabbed her phone and stared at his name in her contacts. It was so simple, yet her hand trembled as she typed the message. "Would you like to come over for dinner sometime? I'd love to hear more about your writing." Her thumb hovered over the send button for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a deep breath, she pressed it. The reply came almost immediately. "I'd love that. Name the day." Marissa set the phone down, her pulse racing. She had crossed the line from contemplation to action, and there was no turning back. In that moment, her fear didn't vanish, but it dimmed, overtaken by something new, hope. The days leading up to their dinner felt like a whirlwind. Marissa couldn't remember the last time she had fretted so much over something as simple as hosting a meal. It was absurd, she knew, but the thought of Ethan stepping into her home filled her with a nervous energy that both thrilled and terrified her. She spent hours tidying the house, though it was already spotless. She moved books back and forth on the shelves, adjusted the cushions on the couch at least 10 times, and debated endlessly over what to cook. Something impressive? No, that would seem like she was trying too hard. Something simple. But then he might think she didn't care. By the morning of the dinner, she finally settled on a middle ground. A roast chicken with herbs from her garden, a salad, and a lemon tart she hadn't made in years but knew by heart. When the doorbell rang that evening, her breath caught in her throat. She took a moment to smooth her blouse and steady her hands before opening the door. Ethan stood there, holding a bottle of wine, and wearing a smile that seemed to light up the entire porch. Daisy wasn't with him this time, and he seemed almost apologetic about it. "I didn't want her to cause chaos," he explained, stepping inside. "But she sends her love." Marissa laughed, the sound coming easier than she'd expected. "I'm sure she'll forgive you for leaving her behind." As Ethan walked into her home, Marissa saw it through his eyes. The soft, worn furniture, the carefully arranged knickknacks, the framed photos of her children on the mantel. It wasn't grand, but it was hers, a reflection of the life she had built. "It's cozy," Ethan said, looking around. "Feels like the kind of place where stories happen." His words warmed her in a way she couldn't quite explain. Over dinner, their conversation flowed as naturally as ever. Ethan told her about a hike he'd taken that week, describing the golden leaves and crisp air so vividly Marissa could almost smell the autumn breeze. She shared memories of her children's favorite fall traditions, their laughter echoing in her voice. But as the evening wore on, Marissa noticed something different. There were moments when Ethan's gaze lingered a little too long, when his laughter seemed softer, almost intimate. And there were moments when she caught herself mirroring him, leaning closer, smiling at his every word, her heart racing in a way she hadn't felt in decades. After they finished dessert, Ethan helped her clear the table, their hands brushing as they reached for the same plate. The touch was brief but electric, sending a shiver through her that she quickly tried to mask. "Thank you for this," Ethan said as they stood in the kitchen. His voice was quieter now, more serious. "I can't remember the last time I had a meal that felt this warm." Marissa's throat tightened, but she managed a smile. "I'm glad you came." He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. For a moment, the space between them felt charged, the air thick with something unspoken. And then he stepped back, the moment passing like a whisper. "I should get going," he said, his tone light again. "Daisy's probably wondering if I've abandoned her." Marissa walked him to the door, her heart heavy and light all at once. As he stepped outside, he turned back. "Same time next week?" he asked, his smile tinged with something hopeful. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. As she closed the door behind him, Marissa leaned against it, her heart pounding. The evening had been everything she hoped for and more. But now, in the quiet of her home, the questions returned, louder than ever. Was this just a friendship, or had they both felt something more? And if it was more, was she brave enough to let it happen? The following week felt like an eternity. Marissa counted the days, each one seeming to stretch longer than the last as she anticipated Ethan's return. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart leapt in her chest. Was it him? Was it time for another dinner, another evening together? The moments in between their meetings felt somehow smaller, insignificant compared to the moments when they shared time and conversation. When the evening finally came, she found herself staring at the table, arranging the silverware for the umpteenth time. She had planned nothing extravagant, just a simple pasta dish, a glass of wine, but her nerves still buzzed. She couldn't help it. Something about this felt different, and she wasn't sure whether it was excitement or dread. She decided to wear something that made her feel good, though not overly dressed. It had been a long time since she'd cared about these things, what she wore, how she looked, but tonight for Ethan it felt important. She chose a soft, deep green sweater and black pants. It was comfortable, simple, yet just a little more than what she'd typically wear on a regular evening at home. She brushed her hair back and glanced at her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked familiar but different, like she'd grown, like something had awakened in her. When the doorbell rang, she felt her heart race. It was the same rhythm, the same intensity she'd felt when she was younger, preparing for dates that she had almost forgotten the taste of. She opened the door and Ethan stood there, holding a bottle of wine and that same warm, open smile. "I thought I'd mix it up this time," he said with a wink, stepping inside. "No dogs, just me and the wine. I think we'll survive." She laughed, the tension in her shoulders easing just a little. "It's good to see you." Dinner passed easily. They moved through it with ease, laughing, sharing stories, eating, drinking, and yet there was a shift. A quiet tension, a new energy between them. Her breath felt a little shallow, her pulse a little faster. She noticed how he leaned in when he spoke, how his gaze lingered just a fraction longer than it had before. And she couldn't deny that she felt it too. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Ethan had insisted they take their wine there, and they sat side by side on the couch, the soft flicker of candlelight casting long shadows around them. The air between them felt charged, like something had shifted into place, as if they both knew they were teetering on the edge of something that could change everything. Ethan placed his glass down, his fingers brushing hers as he did. The touch was simple, an accident perhaps, but it was enough to send a spark through Marissa's chest. He looked at her then, his gaze soft, searching, and it took everything in her to hold a stare. Her breath caught. "You feel it too, don't you?" Ethan asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Marissa didn't speak for a moment. The truth hung in the air between them, as undeniable as the pull she felt towards him. It was no longer a question of if, but when. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I do." And in that moment, the world seemed to narrow, to focus on the space between them. They were close now, so close that she could feel the warmth of his skin, smell the faint trace of his cologne. He leaned in slowly, his hand brushing the side of her face, the touch so gentle it made her pulse race. For a moment, everything stopped. The noise, the worries, the doubts. There was only Ethan and the unspoken invitation in his eyes. And then, before she could second-guess herself, he kissed her. It was soft at first, tentative, as though they were both feeling their way through this new territory. But then it deepened, and Marissa felt her world shift completely. His kiss was everything. Comforting, passionate, uncertain all at once. It was the answer to every question she hadn't dared to ask herself until now. When they finally broke apart, they didn't speak right away. There was no need to. The weight of the moment lingered, filling the space between them with a quiet understanding. Marissa's heart still raced, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of it. She was alive, and for once, it felt like she had nothing to hide. Ethan's smile was a little shy, but it reached his eyes. "I wasn't sure if," he trailed off, not needing to finish the sentence. Marissa shook her head gently, reaching for his hand. "Neither was I," but they both knew it didn't matter. The moment had arrived and it was real. As Marissa lay awake that night, the events of the evening replayed in her mind in soft, fragmented pieces. She could still feel Ethan's kiss, gentle but full of promise, and she smiled, even as she tried to process everything she was feeling. Love. What was love really at this stage of her life? She had known it before, of course. She had loved her husband, raised her children with a quiet kind of devotion. But this was different. The fluttering in her chest, the intensity of it, was unlike anything she had expected or thought she would experience again. She thought of all the things she had told herself over the years. Love belonged to the young, the beautiful, those with the future ahead of them. She had accepted that, resigned herself to it even. Her life was quiet, routine, marked by the steady rhythm of singlehood and motherhood, all the while silently burying a part of her heart, convincing herself it wasn't worth pursuing. But now, with Ethan, everything had shifted. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't old or irrelevant. She was a woman, full of desire and possibility, with the right to feel whatever she wanted. And the truth was, her age, her experience, only deepened the connection she shared with him. She had questioned her feelings, wondering if they were just a passing phase, an unexpected longing that would fade when the novelty wore off. But as she lay there, she knew deep in her bones that it wasn't. Ethan made her feel alive, not in a fleeting way, but in a way that touched something deep and lasting. But what about the world outside? What would people say? Would they understand? Would they judge? These questions were still there, looming, like the shadows in the corners of her mind. It was hard not to wonder how her children would react, how her friends, her family, would see her now with a man half her age. It wasn't as if the world had changed overnight, and age gaps like theirs were often met with raised eyebrows, whispered comments, and uncomfortable silences. Yet, as Marissa thought about it, the fear of judgment seemed less important. The connection she had with Ethan was real. She knew that now, and that knowledge filled her with a quiet strength. There was something about their time together that defied expectations, that refused to conform to the narrow definitions of love that society often imposed. Marissa had lived through decades of life, joys and losses, triumphs and mistakes, and yet in Ethan, she had discovered a kind of love she hadn't known was still possible. It wasn't about age, or how long they had left. It was about the deep understanding between them, the way he saw her not just as a mother or a woman of a certain age, but as a person, someone with her own story, her own desires. She reflected on what love had taught her over the years, that it wasn't about time, or the years that had passed. It wasn't about how much was left or how old you were when you found it. Love was about connection, the kind that transcended every barrier, every doubt, every hesitation. It was about finding someone who could see you, truly see you, for who you were and who you could be. And that was what Ethan did for her. He saw her. Not her age, not her past, but the woman who still had dreams, who still had the capacity for passion, for joy, for laughter. For the first time in a long time, Marissa embraced the uncertainty with a quiet courage. She didn't have to have all the answers. She didn't need to worry about how long it would last or what people might think. She just needed to live here now with him. And in that moment, she realized that the true gift wasn't just the love they shared. It was the permission to love herself fully, unapologetically, in all her complexity. Age, time, and expectations didn't matter. All that mattered was the connection between them. With a deep breath, Marissa closed her eyes and allowed herself to drift off to sleep, the warmth of his touch still lingering on her skin. Tomorrow would bring its own set of challenges, but for tonight, she could rest easy, knowing that love that was hers, love that she had fought for, was real. The days that followed felt different, more vivid. The early morning light through her kitchen window seemed brighter, as though it, too, had witnessed something extraordinary. Ethan continued to visit, each time bringing new laughter, new stories, and more of that quiet warmth that made her heart beat a little faster. She no longer worried about the questions that had once consumed her, about her age, about the whispers, about what was expected. What mattered now was the truth between them, the connection they shared. They didn't need permission to love each other. They only needed to be present in it. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden, sipping tea and talking about nothing and everything, Marissa realized that her fear had dissipated. The vulnerability, the uncertainty, that nagging voice that asked whether it was too late, too odd, had all faded into something far simpler: peace. She wasn't afraid of love anymore, not of the risks or the judgments. Love was just love, beautiful and wild, quiet and intense, and it could come at any stage in life. "I think I've learned," she said softly, looking at Ethan with a smile that was both content and full of wonder, "that love isn't something you plan for. It's just something you let happen." Ethan reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers with a tenderness that felt like a promise. "I think you're right," he agreed, his voice filled with sincerity. In that moment, Marissa felt a deep sense of gratitude. For the first time in years, she wasn't looking backward, trying to recapture what was lost. She wasn't clinging to any idea of youth or perfection. She was looking forward with open eyes to whatever came next. Her love for Ethan was not a rebellion against age or time, but an embrace of what life had to offer at this moment. It was raw and real, untouched by expectations or the pressures of conformity. It was theirs, and that was enough. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange, Marissa reflected on the quiet wisdom that comes with age. She had spent so many years thinking love was something that came only once, in the bright, bold days of youth. But now she knew better. Love could find you at any time in any form. All it took was an open heart, a willingness to embrace it, and the courage to let go of the rules you'd built around it. She squeezed Ethan's hand, her heart full. "Thank you for showing me this," she whispered. He smiled, a soft, understanding smile that made her feel seen in the most beautiful way. "No," he said, his voice low. "Thank you for letting me." And in that quiet moment, Marissa knew something deeper than any spoken words. She had found love again, not despite her age, but because of it. And it was everything. The world would keep turning, and life would continue its rhythm. But for Marissa, the journey had become something new, something richer, more beautiful, and filled with the promise that love, at any age, was worth every step.